Okay, so we've just talked about matrices being a rectangular array of numbers with, if it's an m by n matrix, there were m rows and n columns. Well, now we're going to define a vector. A matrix with only one column is called a column vector, or simply a vector. Okay, an example of a vector that has two entries would be written like this. Now you're going to see them written several ways. Sometimes they'll have it just written, some authors use brackets like this to denote a vector. Some of them just use parentheses to denote a vector, which can be confusing. You have to be careful about context there, because that looks like a point, but it can be viewed as a vector depending on what you assume that you're referring to. So this is the way we define a vector. You've got two different real numbers, W1 and W2. The set of all vectors with two entries is denoted by R2. So this is a capital R representing real numbers, and then 2 is representing how many entries it has. Okay, so two vectors in R2 will be equal if and only if their corresponding entries are equal. So if I have one vector that's W and X, and I have another vector that I know is equal that has 2 and 3, I know that means that W has to be equal to 2 and X has to be equal to 3. The individual entries, the first entries and the second entries, must be the same for the two vectors to be equal. Okay, given two vectors in R2, we define the sum of the two vectors by adding the corresponding entries. Okay, and I'll show you an example in just a minute on that. So add the first entries together, add the second entries, and that new vector you've created is called the sum. Given a vector u and a real number c, which real numbers are often called scalars, the scalar multiple of u by c is the vector c times u, which this is, I'm defining how to find c times u. It's just the product of each entry in u by c. Okay, so an example. I've got vector u defined to be 1, negative 2, and I've got vector v defined to be 2, negative 5. I want to find 4u, so that's a scalar multiple of u. So 4u would be 4 times the vector u, and scalar multiplication is defined by multiplying each entry in u by the scalar. So this will just be 4, negative 8. Okay, negative 3 times u times v. That's negative 3 times the vector v, and that just means to multiply each entry of v by negative 3. So negative 615 would be the vector negative 3v. So now if I wanted to find 4u plus negative 3 times v, 4u was the vector 4, negative 8. Negative 3 times v was the vector negative 615. And the addition of two vectors, now they have to be the same size. They both have to be in R2 or both in R3. They have to have the same number of entries to be able to add them. So the sum will be negative 2, 7. Okay, so this is looking at vectors algebraically. We're given the two entries and we know how to add them, and we know how to take scalar multiples by working just with the components of the vectors.